In this lecture, we continue our discussion of exploratory research by beginning with a type of study called a case control study. Now, in this study, the researchers would select groups of individuals based on the presence of a particular condition being investigated. So the first contrast between the case control study and the cohort study, which was addressed on the previous slides, is that the case control study will include individuals that have some pre-existing disease or condition. And the term case control is established based on two unique populations in question. The cases refer to those individuals, and they form one of the research groups that currently possess the condition or disease in question. The control situation is a group of research participants who do not have the condition or disease in question. And the goal of this research is it begins by examining two groups of research participants, one with the disease, one without a disease, and attempts to examine previous exposures to possible risk factors and examining any statistical trends that might exist that would account for the cases versus the control. What might account for the differences between these two groups of individuals? And so, as indicated on slide 14, the case control study involves a selection of groups of individuals based on the presence of a disease or a condition. Once again, we're referring to the case group as those people with the existing condition or disease. So it's important to note here that those with the existing condition and disease are not those that develop the condition or disease during the course of the research study. And then the control group, once again, are people without the condition or the disease. Now, one of the challenges in conducting a case control type of study is that the researchers should make every attempt to match the groups on a number of characteristics. And some of those characteristics include age, sex, race, ethnicity, which is not listed here, but there are a number of other factors, socioeconomic status as well. So why is it important to match the individuals in the case group with those of those in the control group? And the whole point is to minimize those confounding factors. And once again here, when we talk about the confounding factors, we talk about those elements that can influence the outcome of a study that we do not want to influence the outcome of the study. So if we're examining cardiovascular disease as a potential condition or disease in the case group, and very likely the individuals in this group would likely include those over the ages of perhaps 40, 50, and the number of people would increase over time, we would be introducing a confounding variable if our control group consisted of 20-year-olds. And so once again here, by eliminating the possibility that age could account for a difference between case and control, we try to match as best as we can. And a few different contrasts between the case control study here in C and the cohort study addressed on slides 13 and 14. The first thing is that the case control study begins by focusing on a particular population of interest. Recall that the cohort study did that as well, but the cohort study could also take an exposure-based sampling approach as well. So, but we don't have that with the case control study. So that's the first contrast with the cohort study. The second contrast is at the very bottom of the slide. If you notice here, this is not a time-based element, but an event-based factor in which the different steps of the research project carries forward. So in this particular type of study, the researchers are not necessarily following the participants over time. In the cohort study, time was on our x-axis here, and those participants were followed longitudinally. And the third difference we see here between the case control study and the cohort study is that the case control study, as already mentioned, includes a group of individuals with a particular condition. So the participants are coming into the study already afflicted with that condition or disease of interest, whereas in the cohort study, the participants are followed long term to examine if they do develop that condition or disease from the exposure of the risk factors. So if we take a look at the case, coming back to the case control study, one study population we might target are adults aged between 50 and 65 years old. This is just one type of approach. And the researchers, if their research question has to do with shoulder pain, the case group would include those adults in this age group that currently possess and may be in the process of getting treated for shoulder pain, and the controls do not have that disease or condition in this particular case, so no shoulder pain. And the goal here is to determine if the participants are exposed or unexposed to a risk factor that may be bringing on the shoulder pain, causing the shoulder pain. Once again, here I use the word cause, but this is not a cause and effect establishment in this study. So one such factor that might account for shoulder pain is the occupation. And so one of the exposed or risk factors here are those that work in jobs that involve a significant amount of physical activity, which include lifting activities. And that might be contrasted with the unexposed, where those individuals are working jobs at a desk, for example, that does not involve lifting activities. And so by examining the patterns of whether those with shoulder pain are a greater proportion of those with shoulder pain are working jobs that involve lifting activities and less that involve desk activities is contrasted against those with no shoulder pain. And that will begin the process of starting to find those clues or those factors that might account for the underlying causes of those shoulder pains. So the case control study is retrospective in nature, which means that the researchers, after selecting the population of interest and enrolling participants that fit those criteria, are examining past exposures of the risk factors, and so it's historical in that sense. And this approach carries some unique advantages. This approach allows for the study of rare diseases or rare conditions, and so we might think, well, why not do a prospective design? Why not incorporate a research design that's longitudinal and moves in the future? The reason, particularly as it relates to rare diseases or condition, prospective studies take a long time because they are longitudinal in nature, and so collecting the data, collecting the information from the research participants is going to be projected over months and years. And those types of approaches require a very large amount of resources. And the problem with taking on a prospective design with rare diseases or conditions, in order to carry out any meaningful statistical approach, the researchers would need to accumulate or accrue a sufficient number of new cases in their research participants over the course of time. And so the advantage here with the case control study is that it's not prospective, it is in fact retrospective, and it's able to gather information that's already existing. The second advantage is that the case control study can examine numerous risk factors or exposures at the same time. Some examples include exposure to viruses, working within a situation or working in an environment with asbestos or lead, a person that has reported an excessive amount of sunburns, a person's previous alcohol consumption. So these are just a list of a few of the risk factors that can all enter the study and be examined simultaneously. The historical or retrospective case control study can also be used with disease outbreaks. And when we talk about disease outbreaks, one such example are food-related diseases. In 2008, the Maple Leaf Foods Company produced a number of meat products that were contaminated and with listeria, and scores of people became ill, and it resulted in 22 deaths. The case control approach was able to successfully track the nature of those diseases, and were able to go back and through that detective work, were able to trace the origin of the disease back to those that consumed Maple Leaf food products. And so you can see in a situation like that, a prospective design would certainly not be appropriate in that situation. But the case control study does have advantages, but it also carries certain disadvantages. The first disadvantage is recall bias, and that's on the part of the research participants. Those that are within the group, the case group that have the disease or the condition, because they are living with that particular disease or condition, they will be able to form a greater ability to recall any previous exposures to risk factors than the control group, because the control group doesn't have that particular disease or condition, and they won't be able to recall that information nearly as well as somebody that is with the disease. Recall, the control group does not have the disease. And the problem with that lowered ability of the control group to recall those exposures to risk factors, the conclusion may be erroneous. So the problem with that is that the conclusion of a study such as that would lead to the assumption that the exposure leads to the development of a particular disease. However, if the control group does not develop the disease, so these are participants that were recruited that do not have the disease, they're going to be less likely to recall those previous exposures. Now, the problem with that is, what if individuals within the control group were in fact previously exposed to some of those risk factors? They're less likely to remember those if they don't have the disease or the condition. And overall, the study would overstate the effects of the exposure on producing the disease, where in fact it may not be as closely linked to the disease in question. The second disadvantage, and this is a basic feature of exploratory research, it's exploratory in nature. So these are studies that examine correlations and not causation. But we can see here with these different types of designs, the cohort study, the case control study approach, we're now starting to move in the direction of identifying those things that cause the disease. The third big disadvantage is to find an adequate control group. So the participants should first identify those individuals in the case group, and then start to seek individuals in the control group, and this is often a challenge for the researchers in a study like this, because the control group should have similar, not the same, it's very difficult to get exactly the same, but very similar characteristics, histories, especially those histories related to the variables in the study, and similar environments or exposures. And it's difficult to track the confounding variables because the researchers are trying to link previous exposures to the to people that have a particular condition. The recall, coupled with the recall bias, that will result in confounding bias, where the other variables that the participants and the researchers may not be aware of could be a factor that's not accounted for. But not accounting for some other lifestyle or life exposing factor or event for the participants would lose out and not examine if it has a relationship. It could have a relationship, and that's what a confounding variable would be. So this ends our lecture on the case control study.